Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Pentagon recently released its new nuclear posture review. Its critics are stunned. Not only the use of nuclear weapons is now more thinkable, but also the threshold for their use has been lowered. Dr. Strangelove would be proud. Is the world facing another dangerous arms race? Cross-talking the Nuclear Posture Review, I'm joined by my guest, Michael O'Hanlon in Washington. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Also in Washington, we have Kevin Camps. He is a radioactive waste specialist at Beyond Nuclear. And in London, we cross to Adriel Casanta. He is a foreign affairs consultant and analyst. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Kevin, let me go to you first in Washington here. I read the report quite thoroughly. I was quite stunned, as I said in the introduction. I'll read you my three takeaways here. The report exaggerates perceived threats to the U.S. Number two, it fuses conventional and nuclear war and pushes for the development of low-yield nuclear weapons. I mean, that's quite stunning if you look at the history of arms control. Oh, and by the way, it's going to cost about $1.3 trillion. What were your takeaways from the report? Kevin in Washington.
Well, I think your title for the show is very apt. I mean, Dan Ellsberg in his new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, said at the time that Dr. Strangelove was released in the theaters in the early 1960s that it was nonfiction. So here we go again. We're going to do this all over again, a new arms race. And that figure of $1.3 trillion, that's probably an underestimate. Anything that the Pentagon touches, anything that the Department of Defense or Department of Energy touches, the cost escalation factor should be referred to as going nuclear. They often go over budget, over schedule. So what could we do with $1.3 trillion in this country in the next 30 years? Infrastructure repairs, paying off the national debt. These are the kinds of things, education, social welfare, that need to be taken care of, not a new arms race.
Who knows? That actually may be more in national interest and national security than this new program here. Let me go to Michael. Michael, you wrote an article for USA Today. Trump's plan for nuclear weapons makes sense. Make your case real quick.
Well, first of all, it makes some sense. I agree with Kevin's concern about the money. And in my article, I did criticize the across-the-board modernization agenda, which, by the way, is not new to President Trump. President Obama intended more or less the same thing. And so in that regard, I would like to see us prioritize things that we need for safety and reliability versus things that we need just to modernize the entire force. The nuclear weapons do need to be safe and reliable. And I think we need the B-21 bomber as well, because we can use that for conventional warfare of the kind we see in the Middle East, for example. But I don't think we need to modernize the ICBM leg as much as the Pentagon believes. And I don't think we need as much new capacity for nuclear warhead production. So just to be clear, the USA Today gave a more robust-sounding title than I personally believe. My view is more mixed on the review. There are some aspects to it I agree with, others that I think are excessive.
Adriel in London, I mean, when reading the report, we always say, you don't think the unthinkable, but this is thinking the unthinkable and actually making it possible. And I'm saying first use of nuclear weapons under conditions against countries that do not have those kinds of weapons. I mean, that is really amazing, okay? And they throw in the cyber thing. Okay, so 1 year ago, Russia, was tampering with a utility company in New England. Is the President of the United States supposed to press a button then? And then you find out it's just a fabricated fake story. I mean, I find this a trigger, and this is what the nightmare of the nuclear age was all about, is that who's got their thumb on the button here? I mean, so somebody attacks his infrastructure and you use nuclear weapons. Is that rational? Go ahead, Adriel.
No, it's totally irrational. In my opinion, it is a precedent. It is a precedent where, for the very first time, the America is explicitly trying to blackmail us and saying that it will use a nuclear response to non-nuclear attacks. It is a is a precedent. So when you look at the language, how it is created, the structure, I mean, in the sense of what sort of threats America has. Obviously, it is exaggerating the nuclear power capabilities of China. Obviously, this whole report is aimed at Russia. You shouldn't look other way. It is aimed at Russia. It's from the very beginning, and we should know that even though that many, proponents of Donald Trump were supportive towards him, saying that, oh, he's the man who is facing obstacles in the White House. He's trying to, swamp the deep state or whatever. No, he's the man in the White House. He's the man who is over there. And even though that, the whole American system is broken, it is a fact that it is, disproportionate. It is disproportionate. How can you use the language of this sort of language? I mean, threats, to the vital interests of the United States, its partners and allies, vital interests. But what are these threats?
Okay,
what are
Kevin,
these threats?
Kevin, I get one of the other things, it's really quite shocking, is that using this smaller weapons in their capacity to destroy. I mean, but if you're on the receiving end of even, let's say it's a nuclear weapon half the strength, a quarter of the strength of Hiroshima. But if you're on the receiving end of it, you're not going to say, well, how should we respond? Because it was 25% of the grade that hit Nagasaki. No one thinks that way. No one thinks that way. If you're attacked with a nuclear weapon, you're going to respond, and you're going to throw everything you've got, because that's an existential threat. What are these people in the Pentagon thinking? And I want to talk about this guy, Keith Payne, about his article in 1980. I'll ask Michael about that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
Well, George Shultz just days ago said a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. So thresholds being crossed. I mean, I look at the report called Nuclear Famine by International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, that said if just 100 Nagasaki-sized bombs were exchanged, let's say between India and Pakistan, that was the case study, it would cause a nuclear winter that would starve 2 billion human beings. So these are not games to be played with. Abolition is where it's at. The Nobel Peace Prize last December went to International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons and the Hibakusha, the survivors of the only explicit use of nuclear weapons in warfare from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We had better abolish these weapons before they abolish us. Kennedy said that in '62. Kissinger said that 10 years ago in an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal. We are living on borrowed time.
Okay, and Michael, we have to remind our viewers that under international law, first use of nuclear weapons is illegal, okay? Unfortunately, that wasn't even mentioned in the report, okay? I'd like to point out one of the people, apparently, from what my research is, Kevin Payne, president of the National Institute for Public Policy. He was one of the drafters of this report. And in 1980, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, he was talking about winning a winnable nuclear war. And I would like to put a quote here, where it could be limited, the casualties could be limited to, quote, approximately 20 million people, quote, a level compatible with national survival and recovery. What in the world is this guy doing with this report?
Well, Secretary Jim Mattis is the guy who ultimately authored it. And let me explain what I think his thinking was. I understand, by the way, I agree with a lot of the criticisms we're hearing here about where the state of play is between the nuclear superpowers today. It feels like it's a throwback. It's very regrettable that this is where we are. But there's a sense, and with apologies to Russian friends, there's a sense that Russia has been really throwing its weight around in the nuclear domain, violating the INF Treaty. I know we could debate whether that's true or not, but I'm telling you the perception from the Pentagon, violating the INF Treaty, having some new concepts like escalate to de-escalate, whereby Russia would use a few nuclear weapons early in a war and try to prevent us from, let's say, reinforcing Estonia or Latvia.
Michael, that is Pentagon game scenarios. Those are scenarios coming out of the Pentagon. I can tell you Russia's policy on use of nuclear weapons is very, very clear. We had Russia's foreign minister come out, and I will quote him, entirely defensive scenarios, and I'll give you, and there are 3 of them, in response to an act of aggression against Russia and or against our allies if nuclear or other types of mass destruction weapons are used, and also, third, with the use of conventional arms, but only in case our state's very existence would be in danger. So I don't care what the Pentagon says in its report. That is Russia's policy. policy, okay? Sorry to interrupt.
This is
Go
ridiculous. You know, it is ridiculous because most recently, International Institute of Strategic Studies, a think tank based in London, published the assessment of this review, saying that they don't think that Russia is that stupid to use the nuclear weapons. So I don't know what on earth and who on earth in Pentagon is having this assumption or is trying to portray or implement and, you know, persuade the public opinion that the Russians or the people who are running Russia are, are the barbarians, are the madman who is trying to subdue the whole world, where in fact it's the other way around.
Okay, Michael, I interrupted you. You continue, please.
Well, we do see Russian military exercises that envision early use of nuclear weapons. We do see this concept of escalate to de-escalate in Russian writings. Only in retaliation and escalation.
Let's be clear about that. That is their military doctrine.
I don't think... Okay, listen, I like the doctrine. I'm not convinced, however, that it would always guide Russian behavior. I want to get back to the world you're describing, where the United States and Russia are both very clear that they don't view each other as adversaries and they don't envision needing these weapons against each other.
That report,
that's the world we should be in.
Reading that report is very adversarial. I mean, almost every few paragraphs is very adversarial. I mean, I'm sorry, Michael, but it was directed against the United States and China, okay? 10 seconds before we go to the break. Go ahead, Michael.
It was directed against Russia and China, you're right. And I agree that it's an unfortunate state, but I think it was brought upon largely by perceived Russian aggressiveness in this domain. Whether you agree with that perception or not, that's where Mattis is coming
we're going to go to a break here, but I'd like to point out to our viewers that it wasn't Russia that overthrew the legitimately elected government in Kiev in February 2014. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Nuclear Posture Review. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Nuclear Posture Review. Okay, Kevin, I'd like to point out to our viewers, this is very heated here, but this is a very important topic. Of course, Michael did write something in USA Today, but it's gotten very little coverage on the cable stations, which I think is really an indication of just how these kind of issues were taken away from the public square, because I think people should be talking about these things here. Having said that, Kevin, it seems to me that there's some lessons being unlearned here, and we called it MAD, Mass Assured Destruction. And it seems to me the U.S. is unlearning that. The major nuclear powers all understand that, That's probably why they haven't been used, okay, since the first use by the United States at the end of the Second World War. It seems to me the U.S., reading this posture, is moving away from that. Again, thinking the unthinkable. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, these are omnicidal weapons, and here we are in the era of Trump where, Christmas of 2016, Trump says to Mika Brzezinski flippantly, let it be an arms race. So, no lessons are learned from history here. It's fascinating how this goes back to World War II. If you look at a book like Gar Alperowitz's The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, a big part of the American decision to use atomic weapons in Japan in August 1945 was to tell the Soviet Union where to get off, that the United States was in charge. Little did the U.S. know that the Soviets were just 4 years away from their own nuclear weapon because they had infiltrated the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos in Montreal. They had spies everywhere getting that information. And then with the hydrogen bomb, it was an even quicker turnaround between the Americans and the Russians. We have to get over this American, Russian, Chinese thing. These are omnicidal weapons. We can wipe out our species. As Dan Ellsberg warned in his book, we're talking about, in the late 1950s, the ability to kill 600 million people in a short period of time. Those are the old days. We're now talking about the ability to wipe out, in full-scale nuclear war, many billions of people very quickly, and with nuclear winter, that may take care of the rest of the human population. So if we want to survive as a species, we have to abolish these weapons. It's as simple as that.
Well, I mean, the United States is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it is obligated to do that. Again, that's not mentioned in the report. At least that I didn't see it. Adriel, and let me go to you here. I think there's something much broader going on here. And I think this posture is really all about how the United States sees its unipolar moment with the end of the Cold War shrinking. That window is closing. And I think it is lashing out. It's threatening. It's saying that Russia and China are revisionist powers. I have a hard time believing that. Both countries want to go back to the basic principles of the United Nations Charter, okay? As I mentioned before the end of the program, the United States traipses around the world overturning governments involved in 7 different wars without any kind of United Nations mandate, and they say that Russia and China are revisionist powers. I mean, that is like the pot calling the kettle black. Go ahead, Adriel in London.
No, this is simple Orwellian double speak from America. I'm not talking about American people. I mean, I have many American friends who are, intelligent people, but when it comes to Pentagon and the upper echelons of American political sphere, I get that sense and feeling that they are behaving like a spoiled brat who is dissatisfied with the fact that the world is no longer looking towards them with that emphasis as it was before. So with the attacks on Russia today, with the attacks on Russia as a whole, on Putin, on China, it is emphasizing it is insecurity that its values or its point of view can be challenged. And this is a whole thing about multipolarity, that you and I can, go to the TV screen or whatever, go to any country and get the source for ourselves, to know the news and then assess them according to our knowledge and intellectual abilities. But America doesn't want that. And it's, it is funny, it seems to me as a grotesque, as a person who was brought up in Poland, that knowing that Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty was the radio that, my grandparents or my parents were listening, with their friends in some, places far away from not, being chased by the communists. Currently we are doing this with Russia today.
I lived in Poland in the 1980s. I remember all of that very, very clearly.
Well, I only remember that from my family's, stories that, they were gathering in some, distant places, to be not caught up by the police.
Let's not get distracted here. Michael, let me go to you. I mean, do you see any circumstances where the United States would resort to nuclear weapons over some islands in the South China Sea or Poland, or Ukraine, excuse me?
No, I don't. However, let me say one thing to frame a little bit of where this is coming from. I understand why people who see Donald Trump and some of his behavior and some of his rhetoric would think of this in one way. I want to underscore it was Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis who authored the document. Obviously, it was with...
Whoa. No, we are narrowing the topic to Donald Trump. It is not about Donald Trump. Okay. It is not about Donald Trump, because Donald Trump.
I'm going to be very brief in my comment.
Okay, Michael,
you were very long.
Go ahead, Michael.
You were very long in your comment.
Go ahead,
I'm going to be brief in mine.
Go ahead.
My comment is Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis is a very thoughtful guy, and he's not going to use or recommend the use of nuclear weapons cavalierly, and he does perceive a strong Russian assertiveness in the nuclear domain that he thinks he needs to push back against.
Hang on here, Michael. So is Mattis bluffing? Is this a bluff then? Is this whole document a bluff to scare people?
It's partly no, but it's partly psychological. It is partly to point out to Russia that if they're going to be threatening with exercises, with buzzing aircraft, with doctrines or concepts of escalate to de-escalate, that we can respond in kind.
On whose border, Michael? On America's border, on the eastern seaboard, off of California? Is that the border Peter, you're talking about?
You know my views on.
Okay, really? I mean,
you know my views on NATO expansion. I think it's gone far enough.
Okay.
I agree with your concern that we need a new security architecture for Eastern Europe. I hear your point on that issue. But nonetheless, it's Russia that's buzzing NATO airplanes. That's an act of aggressiveness
what are NATO airplanes
that Mattis perceives a need to respond to.
And that's buzzing Russia's borders. If Russian planes did that on the same basis, regular basis over New York, what do you think the response would be? It'd be outrage, okay? We've already had that. Kevin, let me go to you here. Is there going to be a new arms race here? Because you know what? The U.S., with this kind of documentation, this is what, the third report this year about its posture. It's all military. It's all force. It's all about hegemony, okay? And, you know, because of the hostility that comes out of Washington towards Beijing, towards Moscow, they will react. Does the U.S. want an arms race? Then they'll get one, okay? What good does that do for the world? Go ahead, Kevin.
Right. It will be an arms race. Trump said, let it be an arms race. Let's spend $1.3 trillion or more. You know, look how close we came. You mentioned the buzzing of borders. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. If not for Vasily Arkhipov on a Soviet sub voting against launch of a nuclear-tipped torpedo that the U.S. did not even know was there, we could have wiped out the human race in October of 1962, the man who saved the world. It happened again in 1983 with Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet nuclear commander who refused to believe the glitch in the computer that mistook a sunrise for a nuclear launch by the United States. We have played with fire for 75 years with these nuclear weapons, and if we continue to do this, it's going to be the end of our species. That's what Beatrice Finn of the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons warned just a couple months ago at the Nobel Prize ceremony. We either abolish these weapons or they will abolish us. That's what's at stake here.
Okay, Adrian, one of the things that if we get these lower grade weapons, don't you think that's going to entice countries, for example, South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia? I mean, if you can play with little nukes, okay, that's not so bad, okay? I mean, what it is it normalizes nuclear weapons for, you know, it's like a second-tier powers. I mean, how does that make the world safer? I can't understand it. I mean, maybe Brazil and, you know, Argentina will get in the acts too, okay? I mean, the United States should set a positive precedent. The only country in the world to ever use nuclear weapons against a civilian population, a country that didn't have those weapons. We're going backwards. Adriel, go ahead.
I mean, with that recent move, America just literally shot itself in the foot. Because, as you've said, it opened the opportunities for other countries to, you know, to say, look, if the Americans are upgrading themselves, what about us? There's no, you know, safety anymore. Talking about, you know, North Korea and attacking North Korea with the mini nukes. What does it mean, mini nukes? It is still a nuke. It's a still nuclear weapon. So it still harms people who are over there. So I will never, you know, be for this motion. I'm strongly against using any type of nuclear weapons because, as you've mentioned, you know, we had our lesson. I mean, at least us, you know, my generation had the lesson from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I don't want to see, you know, people in Korea, my contemporaries, being, you know, so much devastated as the Japanese were at that time. So I don't believe, and you know, it is posing one serious question. If America wants to lead the world, what does it say? Her moves, the recent moves, and you know, the actions towards, you know, upgrading its
Let me jump in
arsenal.
here. I want to be fair. I want to give Michael the last word here. Michael,
okay, yeah.
maybe the silver lining in all this is that maybe Russia, China, and the United States can actually sit down and maybe start thinking about a new architecture for the use of these weapons. Maybe. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I hope so, Peter. I'm hopeful that we are actually at the worst of it now, maybe even coming out of it. And I do agree with President Trump's inherent instinct that U.S.-Russia relations should not be so bad and that we need a new approach. Unfortunately, as you know, we're still bogged down in the 2016 election debate here, so it's sort of impossible in the United States right now to move beyond that at the moment. But I am hopeful that we're going to be able to move out of that. On the issue of the low-yield nuclear weapon, I think you were exactly right, Peter, earlier when you said there really is no meaningful distinction. We shouldn't think these weapons are somehow more usable. Again, if I want to interpret for you what I believe the Pentagon views as the reason for doing this, they see that Russia has a lot of tactical nuclear weapons. They don't want Russia to get the sense that somehow only Russia can engage in this kind of coercive activity,
Alrighty.
and therefore we want to push back.
On that,
so I'm hopeful that once we've done it, we can move on.
On that last point there, we've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.